I'm a preacher in the historically black church tradition, and we have a tradition of call and response. So I'm going to try this one more time. Let's see how you guys are actually doing. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, that's much, much better. Thank you all so much for being here this afternoon it's interesting, we're having a conversation about food justice during lunchtime, so hopefully you got to grab something to eat on your way in. And thanks again to the YMCA for having me this afternoon. I first met Sister Jones on a day when the vibrant reds and yellows began to overtake the green leaves. In the 7 months since I'd been working as an outreach worker with Community Food Advocates, a Nashville-based nonprofit with the mission of ending hunger by creating a healthy, just, and sustainable food system, my job had taken me to some unconventional places, to say the least. Homeless campsites, pool halls, all in the name of trying to reach out to those who were facing hunger on a daily basis. So health fair in a church basement was a little bit of a welcome retreat for me. As I walked in, I instantly felt at home. The smell of chicken and collard greens reminded me of my church on the south side of Chicago. After arranging my pamphlets in perfectly symmetrical lines, I lifted my head to see Sister Jones staring down at me. The creases and wrinkles in her mahogany skin told a story of a life marked by hardships, yet her smile was a living testimony to God's faithfulness. In a soft voice, she explained her dilemma to me. After working for over 30 years for the Tennessee Department of Sanitation, she found herself struggling to make ends meet. This month, she had to choose between purchasing vital medication that she needed to survive and feeding herself. At the time, the only thing in her pantry were ketchup, eggs, and a jar of pickles. Now, Sister Jones's problem is not unique. You see, her story is one of the many hidden narratives of hunger in the United States. The face of hunger in the United States is changing. It's no longer bound to inner city ghettos or rural communities. Hunger's near. The face of hunger can be seen on our elderly neighbors' faces, like Sister Jones, choosing between food and medication each month. The face of hunger sits next to us in our pews, and more often than not, the face of hunger is the face of a child. In the shadows of a nationalistic discourse that frames America as a land of plenty, millions of Americans find themselves without the basic food resources they need to live an active, healthy life. The United States Department of Agriculture estimates that over 14%, or 17.5 million, American households were food insecure, meaning simply that there were times throughout the year that these families didn't know where their next meal was going to come from. These statistics become even more alarming when analyzed by race and gender. Nearly a quarter of African American households and a quarter of female-headed households were food insecure. 1 in 5 Hispanic households. In households in spaces that are metropolitan, and also in my adopted home, the South, we're almost 5 times more likely to experience food insecurity. Now, I stand to you today, obviously, in a collar. And that's because hunger in the United States is an interfaith issue. It doesn't discriminate on the basis of religion or race or gender. It transcends geography, political affiliation, and age. The pervasive nature of this issue is why religious communities of all shapes and sizes have made the issue a priority for decades. Each day, temples, synagogues, churches, and mosques open their doors to contribute groceries and feed those in need. The strategies employed by these faith communities often fall in two different camps. One around direct access. So that's the food pantries that we have and the soup kitchens that we have. And the other in more of an advocacy role. So organizations like Bread for the World, Mizan, a Jewish response to hunger, and Islamic Relief regularly advocate for stronger national anti-hunger policies and a stronger safety net by supporting programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program that are known as SNAP or food stamps. It's where I spent 5 years of my career, along with a variety of child nutrition programs. These interventions are certainly a really important part of what it means to alleviate hunger nationwide. Yet, as people of faith, and those of no religious affiliation at all, that are deeply rooted in an ethical commitment to end hunger, we have to be careful not to confuse alleviation of hunger with eradication. You see, hunger is a symptom. To diagnose the illness, we must first name the systemic issues that allow the infestation to spread. Issues like transgenerational poverty, the failure to pay a living wage, gender discrimination in the workplace, racism, and the shift away from family farms to the corporatization of our food system. Food insecurity is a complex challenge. Thus, it requires a sophisticated intersectional analysis to begin creating sustainable solutions. Such an analysis invites us to think deeply and ask questions like why food insecurity exists when it is well documented that we grow enough food in the United States alone each year to feed everyone in the world. You see, ending hunger will require more than just a meal. It will require a prophetic vision and sense of moral imagination that has the humility to see the world as it is and the audacity to imagine the world as it could be. As a minister, an interfaith leader, I cannot help but think the prevalence of food insecurity in our country is in part a result of a deep lack of political will to truly see hunger come to an end. Faith communities are in the unique position to be able to leverage the richness of our traditions to make ending food access, or lack of food access, a priority. We have the power to make that moral case. We have the power of moral persuasion on our side. We have the public platform of our rituals and ceremonies to aid us. And working together, I'll say that one more time, together, across lines of faith, we can leverage our assets and maximize our impact to make hunger a thing of the past. So this afternoon, in the remaining time that I have with you all, I'd like to present 3 strategies that I take from my own experience helping my grandmother grow food in her backyard, to crafting an inner faithful response to ending hunger through cultivation, planting, and harvesting. And then hopefully we'll have lots of time for conversation afterwards. So cultivation, as we know, is the process of preparing the soil for agricultural development. For faith communities, that means digging deep into the richness of our traditions to figure out why ending hunger matters not just as a surface nice thing to do, but as a moral imperative of our communities. This picture is from a Sikh Gurdwara in the United Kingdom. How many people know about Sikhism? It's fascinating. It's the 5th largest religion in the world. Founded over 500 years ago, one of the guiding principles of Sikhism is this, langar. So in every Sikh Gurdwara, there's a kitchen dedicated to feeding the poor. Working across, 500 years ago, this was a pretty radical idea in Punjab, India. Inviting people from different castes and class to come and dine together, regardless of background. Now, I point to this example as just one of many examples in each of our traditions that points to why hunger, specifically, is a rich issue for us to work on as people of faith and goodwill. Perhaps more than anything else, our traditions have a lot to say about what we eat, when we eat, what we don't eat, and how we engage with food. I would suggest to you this afternoon that part of what needs to happen to build an interfaith, cross-faith, multi-faith response to ending hunger is first that we have to cultivate. We have to dig into the richness of our own respective traditions to reclaim those parts of our faith that speak to this issue, whether it be traditions like preparing food on a daily basis for the community. In my tradition, the book of Exodus talks about manna falling from heaven. In our text and in the richness of our own traditions, there is a spark. There are resources. There are, dare I say, seeds for us to plant. My friend Michelle, who is also a fellow millennial interfaith leader, once told me that leading from a place of our deepest moral and ethical commitments and engaging others at this level means touching the soul and its longings, questions about what matters to us, why we were put on this earth, and what we hold most dear. These words really resonate deeply with me when I think about what it means to cultivate a community that is concerned on our most deep levels about ending hunger. As interfaith leaders and as faith leaders, we have to be rooted in a critical awareness of our own moral and spiritual orientation. For me, as somebody coming from a historically Black church tradition, that means digging into the food culture within my own community and church. Knowing that as a generation of folks who came out of slavery from the South, food can sometimes be a place of pain. That growing food and the land was not always a space of liberation for us, as slavery led to sharecropping, led to a great migration north away from agricultural existence. But I also know that no matter when I go to my church, there's likely to be a chicken dinner happening that Sunday. So that food plays a central role, not only in the rituals of our traditions around things like Holy Communion, but also in what it means for us to build and be in relationship to one another. So the first thing that we have to consider when building an interfaithful response to hunger is figuring out what is it about our own respective traditions and moral and ethical spaces that drives us to do this work. Before we can do interfaith, we need to know where we stand on some of these issues and where it is we come from. So after we begin this process of cultivating, of digging deep, of resonating and trying to figure out through the depths of our traditions why hunger matters to us, the second stage is really planting. Figuring out what those seeds are to build just relationships across lines of faith. What's interesting about that process of cultivating is that it helps us identify some of the challenges that our communities face. And in naming those challenges, we can begin to recognize similarities across different faith traditions. So one example of an organization that does a really good job of planning and sowing seeds for justice around these issues is Interfaith Worker Justice, a Chicago-based organization that works at the intersection of worker rights issues. Founded in 1996 by Reverend Kimberly Bobo, IWJ currently has affiliates in over 70 different organizations nationwide. Recently, Interfaith Worker Justice has taken up a new campaign, and I think this starts to get at that hunger is not, like I said, just that immediate need, but also addressing the systemic and structural issues that leads people to be in hunger in the first place. Part of what IWJ is doing in solidarity with the Christian Lent season is a fast from fast food. Now, it's not just for people to get skinny or get right health-wise. It's primarily driven by a fast food worker strike. Has anybody seen those pictures and images of fast food workers across the country marching out of McDonald's and other spaces? In solidarity with those workers, IWJ is fasting from fast food to raise awareness of the issue of underpaid wages or non-paid wages, people who are getting paid at a poverty wage to make our food for us. It's interesting, I was reading an article online about McDonald's specifically directing their employees to apply for federal benefits like SNAP rather than paying them the money to live a more healthy existence or a living wage that would allow them to actually feed their families. A little bit of irony in that. So through the Fast from Fast Food, I invite you to check out Interfaith Worker Justice's website for more information about it. IWJ is working to plant the seeds across religious traditions to raise awareness about some of the systemic issues that allow hunger and inequality in food insecurity to persist. So after we plant, after we start to build those right, just relationships across lines of faith through campaigns, through conversations, deep dialogue with one another, then comes the harvest. And I don't know about you, but harvest is often my favorite time of the year. It's a time of celebration. It's a time for those of us who are involved in movement-building organizations to celebrate the victories that we've had. So, as an example of harvest, I wanted to uplift a local story. So, 5 years ago, I worked for an organization based out of Chicago, Interfaith Youth Corps, which does work sort of on the front lines of interfaith relationship building for college students. And one of the stories that we got that year that was so powerful and transformative for us was the story of a group here at the University of Illinois, Interfaith in Action, who responded to the Haitian earthquake by packing over 1 million meals for Haiti in partnership with community organizations. That's pretty incredible. And that was work that was done across lines of faith, across organizations, both student-led groups and organizations throughout the community. It's a sign of what's possible when we start to cultivate and plant the seeds to really see transformative change happen in our communities. One quote that I really love from a leader of that movement and a fellow Interfaith Youth Corps alum, Greg Damhorst, is this: the incredible thing about this project was that it was just a handful of students who got the ball rolling. I started making phone calls, and we found out that the minimum event would require 20,000 meals at 30 cents each. So our student organization set out to raise the $6,000 necessary. The idea caught on with such force, however, that we ended up doing over 1 million meals through $300,000 plus in support from the Salvation Army and other community organizations. That's powerful stuff, y'all. It's a sign of what can happen when we transcend and work deeply to build the relationships, to work on ending hunger, not in isolation, but together as a community. I'll close some of my formal remarks with this, which is another story from my experience working on the ground, and I have many, many stories that I'm happy to share as we open the dialogue. One of the things I hate most is when people talk at me, so I really want this to be a conversation and dialogue. And my experience working with community food advocates in Nashville. One day I was at my office, at my desk, filling out food stamp applications for folks who didn't have access to a computer. And I got a call from a woman who I'll call Christine for anonymity purposes. And Christine had done everything right in her life, right? She had gone to college, she had a husband, 2 kids, lived in one of the trendiest neighborhoods in Nashville, which is a very trendy city right now. But after the 2008 financial crisis, their business closed. They weren't able to find jobs. And so here they were in this beautiful home which they owned and had paid for, but all they had in their cupboard was ramen noodles to feed their family of 4. Through our work with Christine, we were able to get her connected to federal programs like the food stamp program, but also introduce her to a number of local faith-based groups that were doing amazing work helping people get back on their feet through job training, job placement programs, and a number of other initiatives. I'm happy to say today, the last time I talked to Christine, she was back on her feet again. That's just one example of the incredible work that gets done every day and the potential that faith communities in particular can play in making a difference on this issue. So with that, let's have a conversation. Thank you.
I will run a microphone around, and as you have a question or something to add to the conversation, if you can put your hand up as Carletta is doing, and I'll run it over to you. And we'll just pass it around, which is very awkward, but it does help a lot with catching the audio as well because we tape for public access. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks again, Reverend Jennifer, for coming back home, I'll say, state of Illinois. But just 2 things. I was just talking to my dad the other day about the churches and the activities, not just on Sundays. I belong to the AME church here and other churches as well. But they'll have events, and if only they would put up like a flyer at the shelters or where people are homeless, where they can come and get a good meal, not just the same thing like the Daily Bread Soup Kitchen that we have here. They want a variety. Every single day, there's somewhere I know in Champaign-Urbana that people can get a free meal, whether it's a church, a soup kitchen, or something. So that needs, I guess the word needs to get out so that people know that in the case of, not having food, there is some place, at least in Champaign-Urbana, you can go to get food. And then the other thing was when you were saying the planting and the harvesting and all that, what is also broken down is the family. Even back when families didn't have much, the community was a family. And so if person over here didn't have food or family over here didn't have food, this house would provide for them. And it wasn't, I'll pay you back next time. They just all got together. So that's one thing that is broken down, the family or community network as far as helping people with food and housing and stuff. So.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. And I think it's indicative of, again, a lot of faith-based institutions do have these programs available, but we don't know about it or don't advertise it well. And I would add to that part of what I would like to see happen, particularly from a faith-based space, because we do have this infrastructure in place, is thinking about how we might leverage our power in different ways too, right? So not an either or, not a charity or justice, but a charity and justice model of doing faith-rooted outreach. So in addition to having that soup kitchen, being able to have right there a list of social services in the area and access, and sometimes, I'll be honest, we can get a little competitive and territorial about our ministries and programs, right? We get really excited about our one feeding program that we do once a week. We fail to mention that across the street at, the synagogue across the street, they might have a program going on the next night, right? So I think part of it too is figuring out how to coordinate our efforts to more effectively maximize our impact, and then leverage some other assets that we have, the power of the vote, for example. So one of the things that I think is really important when we're talking about a sophisticated response to ending hunger is, again, not just doing that direct service work, which is crucial, because a lot of folks who used to call me said, I need food now, I need food today, but also thinking about those structural and systemic things, so making sure that we have a say in things like the Farm Bill when it rolls around, and talk to which folks don't know, it's pretty, and I think you have a person coming next week to talk about this, but the Farm Bill should really be called the Food Bill. So in addition to covering things like subsidies for crops, it also has the largest federal nutrition program, which is the food stamp program or SNAP program, covered in the same bill. Those are spaces where we need to speak up and say something. And it's also in spaces like Interfaith Worker Justice's fast food, right? That hunger is a symptom of a much wider problem, which is systemic poverty. So how are we as faith communities leveraging our moral voice to say it's not okay that my sister who attends my church or synagogue or mosque with me is only making such and such amount per hour, or is working 39 hours a week and being prevented from working the full 40 hours a week to get health benefits that could really be life-saving for her community. So thank you. Thank you for that comment.
So it sounds like you're talking about growing a moral imperative within what I would consider an amoral system, that being capitalism. So do you see that or think that there are limits to the growth of that moral imperative being confined by this economic structure, or do you think that potentially can grow limitlessly, or we need a different economic structure? Question.
You're going to get me in trouble on camera talking about overthrowing capitalism, right? I think within the current structure that we have, there's a certain way in which we have to speak to the systems and to use languages from my own tradition, powers and principalities that exist, and work to transform change there. I think as people of faith and moral courage, we also have an imperative to speak out against broken systems at times. So capitalism right now is a system that doesn't work for everyone. I think part of that, if I can again lean on my own sort of theological background, is because of a theology of scarcity that's been perpetuated in our communities, right? It's not that capitalism in and of itself is a bad thing. I don't think it is right now, right? But we are so programmed to believe that we live in a society where there's not enough, that we start to compete over resources, or we want to keep certain people down because we think that the only way for us to thrive is when other people are in positions lower than us. And so that's also part of the work that we as people of faith need to do, is think very critically about the theology that we're espousing in our pulpits and in our congregations. What would a theology of enough look like? So a theology in which all people were fed. And I said this in the talk, but we know for a fact we grow enough food in the United States to feed everyone. Yet we have I think the statistic was something like 14% of American households that are food insecure. To me, that's not a production problem, that's a moral problem. That's an ethical problem, and that's a political problem that people of faith can speak prophetically to if we reclaim that space.
While we wait for the next person to put their hand up, I will just throw out there, I think several of us in the audience really smiled, and we're really proud that you mentioned the Million Meals for Haiti project by Interfaith in Action. Greg Damhorst is an alum of here as well. And in fact, the current Interfaith in Action group, as it was then, is a student group of the University YMCA, so they're housed here. So I would just shout out to the students who are here, if you're interested in interfaith work, there is this awesome student organization called Interfaith in Action, and they're alive and well, and they do great work. And they're always open to new members, and they're just really welcoming people, and they're excited about interfaith and sort of the intersection between interfaith and social justice. So look up Interfaith in Action and come check them out.
I really like the points that you made about focusing more on what causes hunger and food scarcity, and I was just wondering what are the ways that Faith Matters Network or you would suggest to start addressing those as like a general public or a student?
Yeah. So for students, I think part of that is recognizing, you guys know the term intersectionality? Such a like funky big word to describe what is a really simple concept, which is there are lots of different parts of our identities and who we are, just like there are lots of different parts of our sort of collective identities and who we are. So when we think about an issue like hunger in the United States, we have to broaden our understanding to be an intersectional understanding, right? To understand that, again, hunger is directly related to poverty, which is directly related to indicators around things like gender. So women are more likely to live in poverty, children are more likely to live in poverty, people of color are more likely to live in poverty. So having that sort of robust analysis as a student and as an activist or as an organizer, I think is an important first step. But sometimes that can feel really overwhelming. When you ask somebody to end hunger, that can feel like a really overwhelming task. It's like asking someone to end racism or end sexism, right? Sometimes that we can get lost in the sort of question of it or in thinking about it. And so a really solid solution, I think, would be to look at what efforts are already happening in your community around these issues, right? So organizations like Feeding America, which is formerly Second Harvest Food Bank, has a presence, I'm sure, in this area. Look at, be attentive to and pay attention to what bills are coming up in Congress and even on the state level that have something to do with hunger, right? Whether that be the Farm Bill on a federal level or on a state or local level. Allocations where money gets spent in government is also an important thing, right? So making sure that some of the federal programs, because one thing that I know from research is that religious communities are the #1 provider of emergency food assistance in the United States, right? Whether that be through food pantries, a number of other spaces. But that assistance is 1/64th of the assistance that's provided by other programs that are subsidized by the government, right? So part of it too is being well versed in what's coming up politically, but also what money is getting allocated where. And again, I think that's how we budget in the state of Illinois and nationally is also a moral issue. Oh, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for talking. I really appreciated the statements you made and the facts you shared. Could you speak to the statistic about how for a fact the United States alone produces enough food for the world's population? And also, if you wouldn't mind, share some of your personal experiences, which you didn't really touch on too much in your talk.
Yeah, so just to clarify, personal experiences being confronted with folks living in poverty or hunger, or when you say personal experiences? Oh, sure. I'm happy to share both of those things. So that's a statistic that's widely known. If you Google, right, I know some people have laptops with them, that question of whether or not we grow enough food, we know that. It's just a fact. The USDA tells us that. The UN World Food Program tells us that. Again, it becomes more of a question of distribution and how we are morally and ethically distributing all this food that we grow. My journey to activism or around this particular issue really begins with the church and doing Meals on Wheels as part of my youth program growing up and seeing, delivering meals to, the elderly, but then going to college and recognizing the trends that I was seeing, right? That the same folks that were having a hard time getting meals, so in this case the elderly, but more broadly, were the same folks who were having trouble getting access to health care, were the same folks that were having problems getting access to jobs in certain spaces. And so going to college at a time when I think people were starting to think, again, intersectionality and this question became more commonplace, radicalized me in a good way to go back into my own tradition and read about what this Jesus guy said about it, right? And for me, we forget in my own tradition just how radical Jesus was, right? Sitting and standing with the least of these, quote unquote, with both the tax collectors and those who had nothing. And going from sort of that experience of, again, cultivating, so digging deep into my own tradition, got me involved in local movements, but first in Boston, Massachusetts, which is where I went to school, and then later choosing a career path through a program called the National Hunger Fellowship, which I would encourage all the students in the room to look at. They are currently accepting applications, I think, and that gave me a taste in a formal structure post-college for a taste of what community organizing looked like. In that case, I was working with food desert communities, so communities predominantly people of color, predominantly public housing residents who had no access to food in I will say affordable, fresh, healthy food in a 1 mile radius of where they lived. And it was hearing those stories that really cemented my path, I think, to making this a priority and getting to know those people. Because I think, too, there's an attitude sometimes in advocacy and activism to separate ourselves, to say, oh, I'm doing work for somebody. But when you start to build relationship, when you start to come to terms with what your own stake is in this, in my case, it was those women who looked a whole lot like my grandmother, right? Who I was talking to and organizing with. You start to realize that we're all in it together, so.
Reverend, thanks so much for being here with us today and for traveling to talk about such an important issue. I wanted to say thanks for sharing so many examples of how help can look and the different ways that faith communities can get involved. And I wanted to share with you an example of something that's happening in Urbana with Faith in Place, with Reverend Cindy Shepard is with us today from Faith in Place and St. Matthew Lutheran Church, and Pastor Bob Rasmus is here with us today. 3 years ago, they teamed up to take what was donated farmland and converted it to a working community-supported agriculture farm. And so we've been working for the last, and I work at that farm now, the last 3 years, they've been working to donate with a mission of 10% to the Eastern Illinois Food Bank to address exactly what you just mentioned, which is this lack of affordable, healthy, fresh food to those that are hungry. And so in the last 3 years, we've been able to donate 60,000 pounds of food to the food bank for distribution in our own community. And I think that's something that we're trying to get the model just right and hone it. There's a lot of moving variables, but one, I'd like to say that that's something that we're trying to get out to other communities for a model that can be replicated. And then I also, since this is a relatively new area for me, wondered if you're aware in your work of other areas that are using donated or low-cost farmland to then convert it to feeding the hungry or feeding food bank districts.
But yeah, there are a couple of really interesting national organizations who do that type of work, and so I'd love afterwards for me to jot down some names for you all of folks who do this work nationally. And thanks for that example. I'm giving a talk on food and faith in a couple of months, and that will be a highlight that I'm using. One of the joys of sort of my experience and being able to travel so much is to hear those type of stories and to hear your story and share it with folks who will be inspired and moved by the work that you do. So let's connect afterwards and all.
Great. Sounds good. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for coming today. One of the things that Illinois is going through a major budget crisis, and I'm wondering if you could highlight some food-related issues, as some of us will be talking to our legislators and so forth, that should be emphasized that you might be aware of that's being proposed that we should know about.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit of an expat in Tennessee right now, so I'm not quite as up to date on Illinois politics as possible as I could be. Names of programs to look out for. So SNAP, or food stamps, is is the largest provider of food assistance in the United States. That's one. The child nutrition bill is coming up for reauthorization this summer in the United States Congress. So just to give context for that, the Child Nutrition Bill is what funds school breakfast, school lunch, the Child and Adult Care Feeding Program, as well as a number of other federal programs that really attend to childhood hunger. And so keeping that in mind and talking with representatives on a state and federal level to make sure that we have a very strong and well-funded child nutrition bill is one way to also do that. And then I would look at other sort of anti-poverty measures statewide that are up for allocation. I mean, I think often in this work we fight the fight to pass the bill, but then aren't concerned with how it's funded. And that is where a lot of the richness and the ability to see our ideas come to scale really are. So Network, which is a Catholic lobby for social justice based in DC, has a initiative around like a moral budget, right, and advocating for a moral budget on the federal level. And so I would also look to programs like Network to see if there are specific programs on a statewide level that are coming up. Or if anybody else in the room knows about specific programs, I would defer to their expertise as well.
Hi, I'm Cindy Shepard, and I work for Faith in Place, which is another interfaith group. And your talk today was very wonderful. And I especially love the way you talked about connections between our different religious traditions and the issues that we face. I want to make people aware that this Sunday there's an opportunity to get some training in how to become a citizen lobbyist. And from 2 to 4 at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in Urbana, Brian Souter is going to come and help people learn how to work the system and make an impact for issues that are important to us. So that's just a possibility. There are things that are happening in this session of the Illinois legislature that do impact food rules and ways that people get fed. So I want to let you know that's possible. I have a card you can take home so you be sure and remember too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
The quick answer is go to that session this weekend.
Jennifer, thanks, as other people mentioned. The Friday Forum sponsored a recent film called A Place at the Table that I just saw, and I thought it was really, really good. And one of the facts that they stated in this film, and correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe Tracy or Ann can correct me if this is not correct, but one thing they talked about was, I think it was the child nutrition bill. When they passed that part of the funding at least was pulled from the SNAP program. Now, do you know anything about that? Or maybe that I was wrong about that, but that was one of the things they talked about, is just you have, like you said, you have to pay attention to how these things are being funded. But if I remember right, that was the case, that funding was pulled from SNAP to pay for this program. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, no, I can't speak to that directly. But again, I think allocations are really important, and where money is getting pulled from is really important. And again, morally, if I could lean on one of the ancestors, Dr. Martin Luther King, who talked about the tripartite evil of racism, classism, militarism, right? There are ways in which we, like, what we fund kind of reflects what we value as a culture and as a society. And I wonder, if you're pulling money from a program like SNAP, which regularly feeds millions of families or helps feed, because a SNAP budget also is not that much, right? You're talking about $4 to $5 a day per person for 3 meals. So it's really not that much. But we continue to fund other programs that aren't quite as beneficial to our communities as a whole. There's a big question mark for me there. But I wish I could speak more to that, but I don't quite know the answer to that question.
Thank you very much for your speech and the insight you've given us. And you did mention this, but I just want to kind of bring forward one of the structural issues, and that is the fight for a better minimum wage, and both on the state and the national level, and I think that that is just one of the things that would help alleviate hunger,
And
as well as a whole lot of other issues. And it seems to me just incredibly immoral to not recognize that people need to be able to support their family when they're working full time.
exactly. And again, I would invite you to look at Interfaith Worker Justice's work, because a lot of the work is around this question of what does it mean to live, not only increase the minimum wage, but to have living wages, right? So that folks can actually thrive in their communities and provide for their families. So thank you so much for raising that point again.
And since Ms. Claire brought that up, one thing that I noticed when you had the fast for fast food, is it like they were keeping people away from there for wages? Because the only situation I have with that is there's still workers there. I'd be torn because that still need to make that money, and they need people to come in, while they're working. So it's kind of twofold. We're talking about raising the minimum wage so that people have a living wage or whatever, but then we're also keeping people from coming in, which would pay the wages that they already have.
So I think that's a challenge whenever we're talking about activism on a particular issue, and this question around whether or not boycotts are effective sometimes. I think what's particularly unique about Interfaith Worker Justice's current fast from fast food is that it's within a finite period of time. So it's during the Lenten season, so 40 days within the Christian liturgical calendar. And the specific ask that IWJ is asking of people is to become educated about the fight for a living wage and for around fast food workers, to pray for them, to have a number of different concrete actions to help, at least in the short term, during the time that they're stepping away and withholding their money, which sometimes it takes withholding our money from certain institutions to wake them up and have them pay attention to what's happening. I lost my train of thought, I'm sorry. But so it's for me, I think it's important sometimes to take that step back and to make that sort of statement with my dollar in addition to that statement with my feet and with my hands and with my mouth. So, and I can give you more information about IWJ's program after the session too.
Hi, Reverend.
Hi.
So I went on a trip through the university with Alternative Spring Breaks for the National Coalition for the Homeless in D.C. As many people know, D.C. is the largest home of homeless people in this country. So we went there to partake in the 48-hour homeless challenge. So 12 other students and I decided that we would be homeless for 2 days and see how it would be. And in those 2 days, the only people who gave us any sort of assistance were religious organizations. They were the only people that gave us any sort of support, any sort of humanity. And I just felt like, why are they not getting government funding? Why are people not aware of this? And it was just bizarre to me that, like, social services is not involved in the lives of homeless people, and it's heartbreaking to me. And I don't know how we can incentivize it to politicians. Like, I have no idea, like, other than using money as, like, how can relieving homelessness alleviate the economic burden? I don't know how else we can incentivize it.
So I think, thank you so much for sharing that story and about your experience. I can tell even from your spirit and energy that it was a transformative one for you, and that you are now an advocate for that community, which is what those sort of challenges are designed to do, is make advocates out of us or push us from a space of complacency into one of action. So thank you for that. So when I did food stamp outreach in Nashville. One of the 5 populations I worked with was a homeless population there, or folks who were without homes, is how we referred to them. And I think there are 2 things. One, from the economic incentive question, because too often it's the dollar that speaks to people. It is more economically feasible to house the homeless than it is to continue allowing them to live on the streets or without support services. When we look at medical cost number, and there's examples out of Utah in particular of that. On the other side of that question, I think studies have shown one of the things that is most likely to persuade people who are sitting on the fence, or politicians sitting on the fence of a particular issue, is for constituents to call them. I know that seems crazy, but we don't really reach out to folks or politicians that much. And so it's sharing and setting up a meeting with folks and telling the story of what it was like for you, and what that experience was like. And as people of faith and moral courage, being able to speak from a position of our moral and ethical grounding to say this is wrong, right? And as a constituent, I believe this is wrong, and as a core part of my faith, this is why I think ethically, morally, we should be working on this issue in a more robust way. But thank you so much for, as we would say in my church, testifying today.
We're at the end of the time that we typically spend. If there are no more sort of public questions, we'll just really say thank you for being here.
Thank you all for having me.